The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? Famous opening words from this famous Psalm 27 today. Last week we were in the most famous psalm, Psalm 23. This week we skip ahead to another famous psalm, Psalm 27. Even if you don't know the psalm very well, you've heard verse 1, you've heard verse 4, and verse 11 often quoted. That's because this is a bright and beautiful and triumphant entry to this psalm. Now, not everything in the psalm is positive, but David begins positive with this beautiful statement of faith, very helpful for us. Let's divide this psalm into 3 spots: heavenly perspective, harried prayer, and hope provoked. We begin and end with hope. Wherever you are in your life today, this psalm will give you hope. Wherever you are in despair and distress and fear someday, if you pull this psalm out and read it, it will give you hope. In Pinckneyville, this is a favorite psalm of many of our seniors, some who've already gone on to be see the Lord. Many times I've read this in hospitals. There are people's faces, beloved saints' faces in my head as I read this psalm to you. Let's begin with the heavenly perspective. That's verses 1 through 6. And the first part, David says, God saves from foes, verses 1 through 3. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the defense of my life. Whom shall I dread? When evildoers came upon me to devour my flesh, my adversaries and my enemies, they stumbled and fell. Though a host encamp against me, my heart will not fear. Though war rise against me, in spite of this, I shall be confident. This is poetry. David uses some great images for us. Light. So here David is thinking of light versus all that's dark in life. Suffering, whether it's physical suffering like sickness or injury or old age, or whether it's moral evil against you, whatever your source of suffering is, even depression from within. Whatever that darkness is, God is light. I love that from Genesis. The first thing God did was create light. And here David says, the Lord Yahweh is my light. You know, for children, light was that protection against imaginary enemies and foes and monsters, right? Children want to sleep with the lights on or a night light. But even as adults, when people want to protect their house, they use lights around it. Generally, we feel more safe in a city or in the country during the day in the light than at night. We often associate darkness with risk. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? And when we're at the top of our game, the very tip of our faith, that's what we say. I fear no one. But he goes on here. The Lord is the defense of my life. That's like a structural defense. A strong wall, a tower. It's structural. This theme of the Lord being a bulwark or a strong defense is repeated in Psalm 46, from which Martin Luther took these famous words that we sing, right? A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing. Now, David's not just writing as a poet, but David's writing as a person who actually experienced conflict and actually fought. He knows God protects. We read that in his role as a shepherd when he was younger, he fought off a bear and a lion. We know that famous account of younger David going out to face mighty Goliath. Later, having to flee from Saul who wanted to kill him, even escaping a javelin thrown at him twice. His son, Absalom, eventually rises up and wants to take David's head, but God protects him. You see, David's not writing from the perspective of ignorance, but from faith. Let us be confident that the Lord protects. This is a statement of faith. God saves from foes. But God doesn't just save us so that we can soak. I see in verse 4 that God saves us for fellowship. God does not save us just to sit. God does not just save us so we can go our own ways. God saves us for fellowship. Now, I doubt you would say, Pastor, I thought God just saved me so I wouldn't do anything. But you might be mistaken to think that God saved us primarily so we would serve. That's a good theme in the Bible. God saved us for us to do good works, to serve, yes. But that's not the primary reason why God saved us. God saved us for fellowship with Him. He wants a close, intimate walk with us. That's His primary goal. That's heaven. Not because God needs us to serve Him or to soak and do our own things, but God wants us for fellowship. There's a beautiful statement here, one of the most famous in the Psalm, verse 4. David's life goal. One thing I have asked of the Lord that I shall seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and to meditate in His temple. Whether we recognize it or not as human beings, our highest need and our greatest desire is God's friendship. To be in a loving relationship with God, to see His glory, is our highest need. I think of humans as glory grabbers. Everybody seeks glory in something. Some people turn on sporting events and they see the glory of human ability and agility. And they marvel, like at the Olympics, and they say, wow, the glory of human beings in motion. Or they see glory in the creation, and they say the glory of a sunset. Or they see glory in relationships. Whatever it is, we have these little glimmers of God's glory throughout creation and human beings, and people spend their lives seeking glory. But the glory we're to seek is the glory, the source of it all, and a fellowship with God. God created us for that. David's wise enough to recognize that of all the things he could have or seek, the deepest need he has, the number one desire of his heart, is to fellowship with God, to have His friendship. It's the Old Testament and New Testament histories. Now, it's good and right when we think of the Garden of Eden, we think of a beautiful place. Beautiful plants and animals in harmony and peace. But what makes Eden paradise is God's presence directly with Adam and Eve. And even after the fall, after Eden, God will be with Israel to bless them and give them joy, right? God creates Israel as a nation so He could be with them, to fellowship with them. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. God's goal in the Old Testament. Then God makes the tabernacle. Now, it's true that God's everywhere, but there's particular places He likes to be and dwell in intensity. The tabernacle, the temple. You hear that in David's language here, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord. That would be the tabernacle, and later the temple that His Son would build. To meditate in His temple. David says, I want to be in the places where God is most near. Continuing on in the Old Testament, after Eden and Israel and the tabernacle and the temple, we have the prophecy the Messiah will come, and God will be with His people. And in the New Testament, Jesus again proclaims that He is the temple of God and something greater than the temple. Jesus says, the very dwelling place of God, the place you meet God face to face, it is I. We meet God when we meet Jesus. And we look ahead to heaven, don't we? Again, we think of many great things in heaven. Relationships restored, health restored, human ability restored. We think of beauty and awe, but the greatest part of heaven is God. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God, says Jesus. And so we'll see God's glory. What David longs for, we'll see. Heaven is this, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord, that I may behold the beauty and meditate in His temple. You see those three phrases that he piles up there? This is David's ambition. Again, I notice in verse 4 that this is his lifetime ambition. Sometimes they honor politicians or actors or different things for their lifetime achievement. Here's David's lifetime ambition. I notice that he says, I have asked, past, I will seek. David's standing at a point in his life and he says, one thing I have asked, past tense, that I shall seek. David says, the sum of my life, my ambition from beginning to end, is to be with God. Three different overlapping images here. To dwell with God, to behold God's beauty, and to meditate on God. All of these have the idea of God as our center. To dwell with God is to park your life there, right? If you dwell with God in heaven, that's where you choose to live. If you dwell with God in the pages of His Word, as you can do, that's where you live. Where your dwelling is, your insurance company knows that, right? Your dwelling is where you live. To dwell with God is to park your life there. To behold God's beauty is to park your eyes there. It's to look at God. And to meditate God is to park your thoughts there. Where we live, where we look, where we love, this is all friendship with God. Note here that we should be aware of fears, David is, but we should not linger on them. Glance at your fears, glance at the dangers, but don't gaze at them. Don't look too long on your fears. You see, David started off by talking about his opponents, right? But quickly he shifts from his enemies to his intimacy with God. Glance at the threats to you and your family, your church. Glance at the threats of the news and then gaze at God. Don't get this wrong. There are many, even in the Christian community, who are negative, who are pessimistic. They spend all the time talking about everything that's wrong. That's not right. We're to be talking and thinking and loving God. We're not to focus on the negative things of the world. We're not to be ignorant. We're to be aware of what's going on. But glance at the negative and gaze at God. I wonder how many of you should spend less time watching television news or reading news online. It just makes you negative. It just makes you worried. If at the end of your day you're all worried and pensive about panicky things and not the beauty of God, you put your mind in the wrong spot. God saves from foes, verses 1 through 3. God saves from fellowship, verse 4. And then I see God protects. Third part, verses 5 through 6. So again, David goes back to how he feels safe. For in the day of trouble, he will conceal me in his tabernacle. In the sacred place of his tent, he will hide me. He will lift me up on a rock. And now my head will be lifted up above my enemies around me, and I will offer in his tent sacrifices with shouts of joy. I will sing, yes, I will sing praises to the Lord. Notice this, that David will seek God's face and God will protect him. God's Son, Jesus said, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you. When we experience fears, not only do we just glance at them and gaze at God, but as we gaze at God and we focus on God, God will protect us. We seek first God's face and his favor, and he will protect us. There's images here. I see the idea of hiddenness. God will hide us from enemies. Two phrases here again. He will conceal me so my enemies can't find me. He will hide me. There's two ways God can protect you. Three ways God can protect you from enemies. He can hide you. The second one is he can hoist you up. He can lift you up where they can't reach you. Right? Here we have this idea. And he will lift me up on a rock. He will lift me out of danger where my adversaries can see me, but they can't get at me. He'll hide you, or he'll hoist you up, or the third one is God will strike down your enemies, which he'll eventually do. But here are the ideas that God will protect. He'll hide you. He'll hoist you up. I think we get a hint of this in Jesus' ministry, especially the Gospel of John, where repeatedly we were told, and no one can lay hands on Jesus because his hour had not yet come. The Gospel of John emphasizes that although the enemies wanted to destroy Jesus long before Golgotha, the Father protects him. John 8:39, they pick up stones to stone him, and it says, but Jesus hid himself and went out of their midst. Now think about this. It's the temple. They're all surrounding Jesus. They have rocks in it. They're going to stone him, and they can't find him. Supernatural protection from the Father. The Father hides his Son, and Jesus won't die until the day appointed to him. Beautiful images here. I can think of three heart responses we can make here to God's protection before we go on with this psalm. Three things we can do. We can retell our rescues by God for our joy and God's glory. People talk about telling war stories or stories of triumph. You and I should be telling and retelling to other Christians and even unbelievers, and then God delivered me. And then God rescued me. And then God protected me. We should make God the hero of the story of our lives, and we should be saying to people, God protected me. If we're successful and people look to us with admiration, we need to be quick to make sure that they know the reason why we are where we are and we've succeeded is God's rescue. So let us retell for our joy and God's glory our story. That's our testimonies, right? I was saved because I was lost in sin and then God delivered me. Or I was in this condition and God saved me. Let's retell these stories for God's glory and our joy. That's what David does. Let us be storytellers to the glory of God. Number 2, let us increase our appetite for God's friendship. Let us increase our appetite for God's friendship. Listen, all Christians long for God. Right? All children long for milk. All Christians long for God. All of us have a longing, a value we place on time with God, right? But not all the same, and that should be growing. A young Christian doesn't long for the face of God like a maturing Christian does. You see, as we grow, we should become more and more, when we read this every year with more emphasis. One thing I've asked for, Lord, I asked for a lot of things last year, but this year what I really want is you more than anything else. As we grow, we should increase our appetite so that at the end of our life we say, God, I'm ready to go. I'm ready to check out of here because all I want is to see your face. And I testify that many saints I've seen in the last days, that's all they would say. I just want to depart this life to see Jesus. Let's increase our appetites for God's friendship. That'll make us happy and excited about heaven. And number 3, let us rejoice our biggest fear has been taken care of. What is the one thing you should be afraid of in life? It's being forsaken by God. Having God someday to say to you, depart. Be away from me. That's really the only thing you and I should fear. Everything else will pass, right? To be forsaken. I was reading a pastor's commentary on this, and he said, you could be on the plane, and you can worry that you're not going to like the snacks they feed you. And you could be worried about the annoying passenger next to you. And you could be worried about if your flight's going to arrive on time. And you could be worried about all these different things. But really when it comes down to it, your basic need is that plane safely arrives at its destination. Everything else is secondary to a safe flight. Or somebody says about parents expecting children, what are you waiting for? They say, a healthy child, right? That's all they want is a healthy, safe arrival. In the same way, if we know God will not forsake us, if we know that in Christ we're accepted, we have our greatest fear taken care of. The counterpart of the New Testament, this is Romans 8:31. What then shall we say these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? That's the heavenly perspective of David. That's verses 1 through 6. Now, if that's the hands raised in praise, the second section, this very verse, hands on the head. It almost sounds like a lament. Let me just read you these verses and then ask, what in the world's happening? Verse 7, hear, O Lord, when I cry with my voice, and be gracious to me and answer me. When you said, seek my face, my heart said to you, your face, O Lord, I shall seek. Do not hide your face from me. Do not turn away your servant in anger. For you have been my help. Do not abandon me or forsake me, O God of my salvation. For my father and my mother have forsaken me, but the Lord will take me up. That sounds different, doesn't it? That sounds like David fell asleep, had a nightmare, woke up in the morning, and was grumpy, right? It sounds like a different person. Liberal scholars will come to this and say, well, obviously this was written by 2 different people. Or you might think this is spiritual schizophrenia, right? How can David write, the Lord will protect me, help? But here's where the Bible is beautiful. Don't you and I do the same things? We go to church on Sunday and we sing songs of affirmation, and on some days we say, the Lord will protect me, and then later we say, Lord, protect me. Can faith and fear not coincide? They do. Even in the same day. You may begin the day by faith and confidence in the Lord. In the middle of the day, it's shaken, and by the end of the day, you're back. You see, this is the difference between the heavenly perspective, looking down, like David does, like God does. Sometimes you view your life that way, believer, and you make statements of faith. And sometimes we're looking up from our limited perspective, and we make a statement by faith. See the difference between the Lord will protect and the Lord will protect. One is said as a declaration of what I know will be true. One is said by faith. David is down under the circumstances now. And he makes this statement, Lord, I feel threatened. And he does what I said we should do in Psalm 23. Because God has promised to protect, then we can plead for protection. Because God has told us what he will do, then we can ask him to do it. That's David, you see. It's not always a bowl of cherries. It's not always positive, but in the psalm we see that sometimes we make statements of faith, the Lord will protect. Sometimes we make statements by faith, Lord, protect me. That's what's happening here. And I see two desperate prayers here. What I read in verses 7 through 10 is, Lord, don't forsake me. Again, hear, O Lord, when I cry with my voice. Verse 9, do not hide your face from me. David says, don't leave me, Lord. Don't leave me. And he even goes hypothetical with us when he says, my father and my mother have forsaken me. I don't think David means his actual parents have done that. But David says, you know, all human relationships have breaking points. Every sense of loyalty we have as human beings can be tested and tried if unwanted. Even in history, have not parents forsaken their children sometimes? Have not people been persecuted or afflicted and they've forsaken their children? David says, even if my father and mother disown me and abandon me, you will not, O Lord. And tragically and triumphantly, we find that being forsaken by parents for the sake of the gospel could happen. Jesus said, you must love me more than your father and mother. And throughout Christian history, we've seen times that people have become Christians and their parents and their family have forsaken them, and they've been cast out. But here's this reassurance. Even though every human being you know forsake you and turn away from you and fail to meet your needs, God will take care of you. That's David's hope. Don't forsake me, verses 7 through 10. And then do deliver me. Do what you promised. Here we hear the note of triumph again, verses 11 through 12. Teach me your way, O Lord, and lead me in a level path because of my foes. Do not deliver me over to the desire of my adversaries, for false witnesses have arisen against me, as such breathe out violence. See, David here says, do deliver me. This imagery of giving him steady steps. Teach me your way, O Lord, and lead me in a level path is the idea of lead me forward, Lord. I need guidance. I need direction. I need to know where to go because there are dangers around. Lead me. This is primarily a prayer for faithfulness. Lord, you have a path for me. I want to walk it. Right? But it can also be a prayer for comfort. Lord, make my journey ahead prosperous and good. When you pray for safety before you take a trip, right? You pray first that you would arrive at your destination, and second that you would enjoy it. It's okay to think the two. One is primarily faithfulness to God. That's the primary, right? But secondary, you can pray for a good trip. We have a beloved senior in heaven, Joyce Cooner. When I came to this church, she would pray that. And Lord, lead me in a level path. And I didn't know that phrase, and she prayed it so many times. I went and looked it up. And Lord, lead us in a level path. That's like a benediction. Lord, be with us to bless us. So verses 7 through 10, desperate prayer, do not forsake me. Verses 11 through 12, do deliver me and guide me. So heavenly perspective, verses 1 through 6. Harried prayer, verses 7 through 12. And then I see hope provoked, verses 13 through 14. In light of his hope, in light of his fears, then David does something remarkable here. Let me read 13 to 14 and then let's ponder together what's happening here. I would have despaired unless I believed that I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and let your heart take courage. Yes, wait for the Lord. See, hope provoked is speaking aloud what's stirring on the inside. And there's two possibilities here. Let me give you both because both can be true. And I'll tell you which one I lean towards. David could be speaking to the community. So David could be saying to people in the worship community, subjects he has, to people around him, he could be saying, here's what I know. Based upon what I believe, verses 1 through 3. What I long for, verse 4, and what I pray for, verses 7 through 12. Let's wait for the Lord together. David might be doing a call to worship. He might be saying, let us hold on to our faith because God will be true to us. That's possible. And let me run with an application there before I come back to what I think is happening here. Do you know that when we sing, it's warfare? When we sing, it's warfare. It is good and right in worship to look to the Lord, but I want you to think about who's near you when you worship. Again, this is one of the reasons why you need to be physically present in the church, not just online. Although if you're watching us online, I greet you and I say that's great, and be fit to go to a physical church. Worship together physically is warfare. So we do look to the Lord. Great is thy faithfulness, right? But we also look around. And we say to ourselves, so-and-so is still singing that song. He's a widow. He's been alone for 20 years. Look at that new widow. She's still grieving, and yet here she is. Look at those parents whose child is sick, and they're still singing of God's faithfulness. Look at that young single who wants to be married. Look at that person with cancer. Look around at all these people who have suffered, and they're still singing, great is thy faithfulness. You see, when we gather together and we sing, we proclaim hope. And it's warfare. Not what this world says, not what skeptics say. We gather together and we say, you are good, Lord. You protect. Today in our service, together, all of us saying, I have blessed peace with my Lord so near, leaning on the everlasting arms. We sing it as warfare. We declare it to the heavens in face of the enemies around us. And to God's glory, we declare we're leaning on the Lord. Worship is not just singing. Worship is not just a warm feeling. Worship is warfare. It's a declaration. It's a shout of triumph of Israel around Jericho. Our closing invitation today. Together we'll sing, when the oceans rise and the thunders roar, I will soar with you above the storm. We'll all sing that. We'll all declare that. God will protect us. That is a right application. That's true, and many of the Psalms call us to corporate worship, but I don't think that's what David's doing here. I think he's talking to somebody else quite remarkable. I think he's talking to himself. In literature, we call this a soliloquy, where a character addresses themselves. Hamlet's soliloquy. To be or not to be, that is the question. When we speak to ourselves, that's meditation. Meditation is muttering it and chewing on God's words and speaking them over and over. It's the thing that somebody hears under your breath as you go by. That's what David here does. He's talking to himself. Let me add to verse 14 his name. David! Let's wait for the Lord. David, be strong and don't let your heart take courage. Yes, David, wait for the Lord. He's addressing himself. David is provoking hope. When we say the words of God, when we say His truth, we stir up our hearts. We seize control of the reins of the out-of-control horse, and we say, heart, obey, hear and hearken. This is the word of the Lord. That's very important. I want to close with a famous quote by Martin Lloyd-Jones, wonderful Anglican doctor, an MD, and also a famous pastor. In his very renowned book on spiritual depression that I commend to you, here's what he says. He makes a distinction on the Psalms between listening to yourself, which too many of us do, and speaking. Here's the quote. Have you realized that most of your happiness in life is due to the fact that you're listening to yourself instead of talking to yourself? That's pretty bold. You're unhappy today, believer, because you're listening to your heart, not talking to it. Take those thoughts that come to you in the morning when you wake up. You have not originated them, but they're talking to you. They bring back the problems of yesterday. Someone is talking. Who is talking to you? Yourself is talking to you. Now in Psalm 24, this is what the man does. David, instead of allowing this self-talk to talk to him, he starts talking to himself. So from Psalm 42. Why are you cast down, O my soul, he asks. His soul has been depressing him, crushing him. So he stands up and says, Self, listen for a moment, and I will speak to you. Oh, how blessed we would be, believers, if we did more of this, if we said to our hearts, instead of following my heart, instead of listening to my heart, instead of believing my heart, I will speak God's truth to your heart, and we will obey. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? Amen.